Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Wendy Cukier, and I'm the Academic Director of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University. I'm a professor there of entrepreneurship and strategy. I lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, as well as the research initiatives around the Future Skills Center and a few other things. So I'm delighted to have a great panel with us today, and hope we have lots of lively discussion. Please use the question function and add your questions in as we go along. I'll try to multitask and keep tabs on those through our conversation. So before we get started, I'd like to ask Grace Quan, who's the CEO from Hydrogen in Motion, to introduce herself.
Well, thank you, Wendy. As Wendy mentioned, I'm CEO of Hydrogen in Motion, and I run a company. We're developing a nanomaterial to store hydrogen under low pressure and very high density. So previous to being the CEO of Hydrogen in Motion, I worked at the Treasury Board as Senior Advisor to the CFO and have worked in development and foreign trade. So have both a public and private history.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Dan Munro, who is Senior Fellow of Innovation Studies, Munk School, Global Affairs and Policy at U of T. Dan, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah. Hi, Wendy. Hi, everybody. So I'm at the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School and also research advisor at the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Ryerson University. And I guess I'd say over the last 15 years or so, my work is focused on that intersection of innovation, skills, and education, and especially on Canada's innovation performance and the distribution of opportunities to participate in and benefit from innovation. And I guess I want to say that I'm excited to participate in this panel today because it focuses in part on a puzzle that I've wrestled with and that others have wrestled with over a number of years, which is that, while Canada has among the most highly educated populations in the world, our innovation performance has been lackluster compared to global peers. So, it will be interesting to hear what others think about how we reconcile and how we address that apparent gap between Canada's Canada's education strength and our innovation weakness.
And I'm sure there are lots of views on that point. Next, I'd like to call on John Hepburn, who's the CEO and Scientific Director of Mitacs and the host of this event.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wendy. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm coming to you from rainy and windy, unceded traditional Coast Salish territory out here in Vancouver, hoping that my power doesn't get cut off because of the high winds, but we'll see how that goes. I am currently and have been for what seems like a decade, but only about 9 months, currently CEO of Mitacs, which is a national not-for-profit dedicated to promoting innovation in Canada. So, obviously very concerned as Dan is with our not great innovation record. We do this currently by largely research-based internship, partnerships between the very strong academic institutions that Dan referred to and industry and not-for-profit needs. So we start with the needs and then we find the appropriate students and university researchers to work on those problems. I'm very interested in today's session because we're actually pondering really more inclusive innovation, and I mean inclusive in two dimensions. One is getting underrepresented groups who are currently not involved in the innovation economy into the innovation economy, and secondly, broadening how we support innovation beyond research-based innovation. There's a lot more to innovation than just using research to solve problems and creating new inventions. And so we'd like to get more engaged with working along the entire innovation continuum. And I see those two things as linked: inclusive innovation and basically redefining how to support innovation across the entire continuum of innovation activities.
You know, and thanks for raising those points, John, because I do think that those two dimensions have a lot to do with some of the dilemmas that Dan has raised, because we know, for example, that innovation is not about inventing new stuff. It's about doing things differently. And while we put a lot of energy into invention, into commercialization, and so on, often we're not paying a lot of attention to issues around adoption, and that has unintended consequences in terms of who gets included and who doesn't. And similarly, your point about rethinking how you're even conceptualizing support for innovation, I think opens up endless possibilities. So thanks very much for that. So over to you, Dan, because you raised the question of the challenge that I think people have been talking about for decades. And in some ways, it started with the discussions around the productivity paradox, and it morphed into now talking about the innovation paradox. So tell us a little bit about your perspective on the relationship between innovation performance and skills, which is really the question we're focusing on today. And I guess maybe starting with your definition of innovation and what the implications are for these issues.
Yeah, I thanks, Wendy. I think that's exactly where to start, because if we want to understand, what skills are required for innovation, we need to understand what innovation is. And while it seems to be a pretty obvious thing, I think once we sort of think about some of the nuance and granularity of innovation, some interesting questions or interesting issues around what skills are required begin to emerge. So, as I and others define innovation, it's largely about generating new value, whether that's economic or social value, by applying knowledge to develop new or improved products or processes or services. Can include business model changes or even changes in organizational structures. And so, this can include a lot of different things, right? So, standard sort of thinking is that innovation is sort of closely related to technology development, but that's only a small part of the story. Innovation can also be about introducing a new process in a workplace or in a supply chain to improve efficiency or to lower costs. It can be creating or implementing a new marketing method to identify and appeal to some new customers or a totally new market segment. It can be a change in management models and processes, or even something like new standards for triage in a hospital that can, say, decrease wait times and improve health outcomes. Right, so there you would get social value rather than merely economic value. So in short, I think innovation includes and involves a lot more than just technology. The key is that an organization has to do something new or different that generates new value. And I think, and we'll get into this, I think, but I think the implication for a discussion on skills for innovation is that we need to talk about more than just sort of the technical skills that are required to do technology innovations. We need to talk about more than just technical and STEM skills. We need to talk about, and we need to develop a wide variety of skills to support a wide variety of innovation types and activities. And I think we can get into that a little bit more, but that's where I come from when I understand innovation and what it means to talk about skills with respect to innovation.
And thanks for that. And I think that John has heard more about this perhaps than in recent weeks than over a much longer period of time. But John, I think it's a nice segue into your comments about how Mitacs is thinking about repositioning itself. So in light of what Dan said about this need to really perhaps rethink how we're fundamentally defining innovation, and therefore that has real implications for how we then think about where the gaps are and where we need to build capacity. Can you talk a little bit about or elaborate a bit more on some of the things you talked about with respect to Mitacs strategy going forward and your views on this issue?
Yeah, and I think it all basically, I mean, Mitacs has always supported basically internships independent of discipline. So, but of course, because of our structure of sort of research-based innovation partnership between industry and university, most of our internships up until now have been in the STEM disciplines. However, when we were given a big injection of money from the federal government in the midst of the pandemic and told to increase our delivery of internships by 5,000, so going from 10,000 to 15,000 this year, we asked the federal government if we could have more flexibility in how we delivered those internships. And as a result of that, we started, for example, something we're calling business strategy internships. And this gets exactly to what Dan was talking about. I mean, innovation is more than just inventing stuff. It's about company develop business strategies. We also are able to work with municipalities because if you look at the sort of problems that we're facing as a society, a lot of them are the responsibility of municipalities. I mean, the homeless crisis in Vancouver and Toronto, that's something the city is expected to solve. Making cities more pedestrian friendly and bicycle friendly. These are urban problems that have to be solved by municipal governments. And so we're now able to work with municipalities. And we're now trying to think about ways of including people like Indigenous people in Canada and BIPOC people in Canada who are excluded through structural barriers and structural racism, systemic racism from the innovation ecosystem. You know, in past, we've always dealt with PhD students and postdoctoral fellows. Well, those are people who've already figured out how to navigate the system. And so I think that this is the challenge facing us, is working, redefining innovation, redefining how we support innovation. And it's something that we're working on currently, and we hope to work on as we renew ourselves, work on more seriously in the future at Mitacs.
And it's so interesting that you raised that, and you earlier spoke about inclusive innovation, because of course we know that if you focus on science, technology, engineering, and math, you're excluding women, you're excluding Indigenous people, you're excluding Black students, and in large part, lots of people with disabilities who are more likely to be in arts and social sciences. So one of the unintended consequences of those narrow definitions is actually to put up barriers to those people. Once you start to expand how you think about innovation, the sites of innovation, the disciplines that are needed to advance innovation, you create more space. So I think it's really interesting that you're linking the innovation and the inclusion goals of Mitacs in this way. Grace, you wanna jump in on this question of what innovation is and the skills needed to advance innovation based on your own experience as I find it really interesting that you're in Treasury Board and now you're an entrepreneur. That's quite the change. You must have two sides of your brain that work.
Yes, it's very rare to have people who have accounting degrees and political science undergraduates to take on the entrepreneurship role and really very, very high tech. I have a team of 9 scientists with theoretical physicists and chemists and material scientists and engineers. It's very, very STEM based. My CTO is a mathematician, so we are all about STEM. But in recognition of the skill set, there is no hydrogen storage expertise in Canada. And so we had to bring most of our experts, all of our experts actually, from abroad. And I think we have to step back and look at the skill set in the sense of, if you want to, I'm sorry, here's my current intern, and sorry, she likes to participate in every webinar. You know, if we step back, Canada has one of the highest educated populations in the world, as Dan mentioned, and we have a lot of SMEs. We have about 1.2 million small, medium enterprises under 100 employees, and 97% of them are small. So, and then medium-sized enterprise, there's only about 21,000, which represents 1.9%, just under 2%. And then 0.2% of all companies in Canada are 500 employees or more. So you're talking about 3,000 companies. So this highly educated populations need a larger company to pay that payroll. The fundamental logistics is very skilled people are very expensive, and you need a bigger company to be able to pay that. And I just want to point out that the government of Canada is very, very supportive of innovation, and the grants contribution program and Mitacs program is fantastic, but they're dilutive because you need to bring 50% matching to the table. And within 3 rounds, these SMEs are no longer Canadian. They're diluted out. So what we're doing is we're creating a platform, incubator of small, medium companies, small enterprises that get taken by other countries, unfortunately. So in my opinion, I think we need to change our grants contribution structure to make it less dilutive, support these incubator SMEs while they're SMEs until they can move to a medium-sized company, and we'll really see a launch. So one of my pet projects is like a Hydrogen Valley incubator center, like a Silicon Valley, to create, the critical mass and generate that offshoot of companies and brain power.
And this is unscripted, Grace, but I am really interested because I know when I was at the Sloan School at MIT, one of the big arguments that they made, and the engineers might make a different argument, but the argument that they made at Sloan is that MIT's success in terms of generating startups and so on was actually driven by the business school, not the engineering school, because it was the business students and the business grads and the business faculty who were able to spot the opportunities and then put together the teams of technical expertise. And it sounds like you're kind of the poster child for that process. I just wonder, can you briefly tell us about how you went from Treasury Board accountant to CEO of a tech startup?
Yeah, it's very interesting story because, well, at least it is to me. But back in the day, I was the senior advisor of the Treasury Board, so I managed $250 billion, and my rounding error was 100 million. But I didn't have to raise any of it, which was a lot easier than having to raise every penny of what we're doing right now. So I thought that really we needed to make a difference in the world, in the sense of the hydrogen economy. It wasn't moving because of some technical pieces, which is really revolving around storage. So once we can crack that storage issue, I think the whole hydrogen economy will make it a lot easier and cheaper and just a plug and play. So that's what we came to make a difference. And I saw the problem, and I feel that I could bring the solution, even though I don't have a storage background. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a physician, a physicist. But I see a problem, and I think I can bring a solution, and that is the heart of being an entrepreneur.
100%. I think that's such a great insight. I wonder if we can just pick up on what Grace spoke about, which is really a little way, in a certain sense, the kind of classic entrepreneurship journey. Somebody sees an opportunity, ideally something that is differentiated, and has the confidence or the lack of sense, some would say, to pursue it without an eye to the resources. I mean, that's the classic thing that differentiates an entrepreneur from a bureaucrat is this idea that you pursue opportunity without an eye to the resources, and your assumption is you'll get the resources that you need as you go along solving solving the problem. So I wonder, like both Dan and John, to the extent that we think about skills and we think not just about the high level sorts of skills that we need to drive innovation and economic growth and inclusion and so on. Do either of you have views on the skills we need to be developing to drive innovation at the kind of micro level in terms of, you know, startups and entrepreneurs and how we can grow entrepreneurs? Because I think it was Jim Bazilli who said, you know, you can't teach everything from a textbook. And I think it's a really interesting example of somebody who sort of learned by doing, which is in some ways what Mitacs provides an unusual opportunity to do in the kind of research ecosystem, because it has always had that much more practical problem solving sort of orientation. So I don't know, John, do you want to sort of pick up and talk a little bit more about this and the implications for skills that innovation is in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that first of all, I mean, Mitacs is in the business of promoting, you know, in a sense, innovation through work integrated learning opportunities. I mean, but when you say that, you know, it brings to mind, I mean, I spent 18 years as a faculty member at University of Waterloo, so I know the cooperative education system very well. We don't do cooperative education at Mitacs. We're trying to build bridges between academia and non-academic partners, typically industry, but also not-for-profits, municipalities, as I said earlier. And the linkage is provided by the students. And if you look at, I mean, University of Toronto had this great project recently where it was called 10,000 PhDs, I think. And they surveyed 10,000 of their graduates in all sorts of different programs and asked them, well, you know, what are you doing now? And to no great surprise, in the STEM disciplines, the vast majority, and in life sciences, it was truly the vast majority, they're not working in an academic setting. They're out in the non-academic sector, typically in industry or with government. And so universities provide great technical training, and you know, that's not something Mitacs claims expertise on, but we can provide the professional training that students need beyond the technical training. And we do that by, you know, giving them exposure to interesting problems that are not originating from the academic sector, helping them. I mean, the problems are defined by the non-academic partners. They're not defined by the professors and by the students. However, the students are willing participants in solving the problems. And I think that's really critical, is to provide people with the sort of teamwork training with all the professional skills you need to succeed. And it's far beyond just technical skills, even though most, as I said previously, most of the students we work with are students from technical disciplines. But we're hoping to change that and have more students from non-technical disciplines and from colleges and other post-secondaries.
That's great. Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder, Dan, if you can jump in here and talk a little bit more at a granular level on what kinds of skills you think are needed to drive innovation. Yeah,
so I think, I mean, like a good academic, I sort of diagnose the problem before I figure out what the solution is. And when you look at, you know, sort of, when you look at some of the pieces in the innovation ecosystem in Canada, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, one of the kind of striking things about Canada is that on surveys of entrepreneurial ambition, as it's called, like this interest in starting a business and growing a business, Canadians are world leading, right? Like we are more entrepreneurially oriented than basically, you know, any people in any other country. And yet when you look at sort of startup rates and scale up rates, to pick up on, you know, something that Grace was saying, we end up being kind of mediocre. So that suggests to me that, at least on one dimension, there's not so much a motivation problem as there is a skills problem. And the particular skills problem is knowing exactly how to start and scale up a business, how exactly to, commercialize whatever it is that you want to do, or concretely adopt the technologies that you need to adopt, how to sort of specifically contact people and contact people successfully to raise money, to do the kinds of things that you need to do. So all of this suggests to me, right, that, whereas we have high ambition to start and grow businesses, and where in many cases we have, a population that has the technical skills and also the sort of general human skills to do many of these things, we're missing the entrepreneurial skills and the innovation management skills. Some of those can be taught, I think. We can improve people's understanding of the importance of intellectual property and the need to protect that and do those sorts of things. We can teach people sort of theoretically where to go to get funding, but you want to complement that with the kind of thing that Mitacs does and that other initiatives do, like work integrated initiatives, which is to partner nascent entrepreneurs and potential innovators or actual innovators with people who have worked through this kind of thing. So you can create a critical mass of people with the entrepreneurial know-how and the innovation skills to actually do this stuff concretely.
And it's interesting because, excuse me, I lost the debate, but I was part of a group that was working on the renewal of essential skills for Canada. And I was arguing that we should be treating entrepreneurship as an essential skill, because whether or not you start a business, you go into a large organization or even government, basically what all entrepreneurship is about identifying problems and coming up with creative solutions. And to me, those are in a very concrete and tangible way. It's interesting because China a few years ago just mandated that all children, all university students would have at least one course in entrepreneurship, and they just made it so.
And Wendy, can I jump in with one other observation?
Yeah.
And that is, and this sort of goes back to some of my earlier comments about the fact that innovation is not some single phenomenon, but it involves different types of things and different activities. I think it's important to keep in mind that for innovation to be successful, and for that matter for a firm to be successful when it wants to innovate, when it wants to grow, is that not everybody in the organization or not everybody on the team has to have all of the skills. What you need instead is a team on which you have different people with different skill sets, right? So not everybody has to be an engineer. Not everybody has to be the expert in intellectual property, but you need a team that brings all of those things together. But what everybody on the team does need is an ability to communicate with the others, an ability to listen to the needs of other people on the team in order to make the whole organization successful, and to work collaboratively on this stuff. And I say this because I think a lot of discussions about the skills required for innovation forget that not everybody has to have all of the skills, right? There are skills that are required, but who has them can be arranged in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. And there's been, renewed focus on the importance of social and emotional intelligence, for example, as core essential skills, right up there with reading, writing, and digital skills. Grace, I wanted to cycle back to you because we kind of started this conversation with your entrepreneurial journey, and you talked a little bit about the skills that you see SMEs in your needing and the shortage of technical skills and so on. But do you have views on what kinds of skills entrepreneurs need, or what things that you had that really made you successful, and where you might have liked to have had different kinds of skills or knowledge or experience?
Well, I think Wendy and Dan, you kind of hit the nail on the head in saying that the motive skills are super critical as a senior leader and to succeed in the world. So, for example, fundraising, nobody teaches how to do that. There are courses that teach you how to manage a funnel, but it's not about the numbers. it's about the ability to connect emotively with someone and convince them that your crazy idea is worth shelling out $100,000 or $1 million for. That is an emotive conversation, and they don't teach it in school. And unfortunately, there's no formal rigor to that, and there should be, because that is a real skill that so many entrepreneurs do not have, and that's why they fail. So
I think that's a really good point. Really good point. How about you, John? Any other insights into where the skills gaps are that we really need to focus on in order to advance entrepreneurship specifically?
I think they've already been covered, but I like Dan's comment about you don't need to have all the skills bundled up in one person. But one of the things that we've been able to try to do, and really it's because of the economic crisis and the pandemic, is provide different skills, especially to small and medium enterprises. And oh, by the way, Grace, we can reduce the cost for small and medium enterprises as well. And we hope to be able to continue that flexibility with government funding. But providing, we're starting a pilot program in providing law students to small and medium enterprises so they can get to develop IP strategies. The business students I already talked about, college students for doing developmental work, and that's also introduces the inclusive innovation. So I think just looking at innovation more broadly and thinking also about social innovation, which has been talked about. It's not just about startup companies in the tech sector. It's about social innovation. I mean, if we can't solve the housing crisis in Vancouver, it's going to be pretty tough for Grace's companies to do well, because only rich investors can afford condos, sort of thing. So I think there's a lot bundled into creating an innovative ecosystem, and I think taking a broader view. Obviously, STEM is important, inventions are important, technology is important, but all sorts of other things are important, and that's what we're finding with the companies we're dealing with is they need more talent than just engineers. As important as engineers are, I don't want to claim that they're not really important.
It's so interesting because just picking up on 2 points, you mentioned the housing crisis. I mean, and social innovation. My argument is often that social innovation is like talking about lady doctors. It's this idea that social is sort of exceptional, and I think we need to get to the stage, because progressive corporations are starting to think this way. We need to get to the stage where we don't see social and economic as dichotomized, but we see them as on a continuum. But it's interesting that you mentioned housing, because, for example, when we think about things like the super clusters or the CFRIFs or the grand challenges typically that get posed, they're almost always focused on solving technology or scientific problems or building clusters around those things. Nobody has ever posited that we should have a supercluster that's looking at solving the housing crisis, or a supercluster that's focused on bringing together the organizations trying to deal with substance abuse or mental health or the lack of inclusion for immigrants. And I think there's if you push this argument that innovation is more than building a new app to its logical conclusion, it would really drive a lot of different ways of thinking about how we even organize our work in this space and how we find ways to include social. And same thing, as soon as you include social, the Indigenous people appear, the women appear. In fact, we found that, at Ryerson, when I was the VPRI, if we organized an event that come learn about entrepreneurship, you'd get the guys primarily in management and engineering and some scientists. But if you said, come and learn how to be a change maker, come and learn how to deal with the sustainable development goals, let's figure out how we can solve the world's to-do list. The women appear, the art students appear, the social science students appear, and so on. And those activities are just as entrepreneurial as a new app. But the language around entrepreneurship in and of itself often excludes people. Artists are a good example, who really can make an important contribution. The other thing that you mentioned was IP, and one of the questions in the question box, which I figured out how to use, is this: how has Canada's IP policy factored, good or bad, into Canada's disconnect between its strength in education, basic research, and its degrade in innovation, according to the conference board? I don't know, Dan, is this something that you've thought about, the way in which IP policy can either impede or promote innovation?
So I would say, to be fair, it's not something that I've thought about directly, but there are a lot of people sort of in my proximity who've thought about this quite a bit. So I have some sort of indirect insights about this. And so I think it's fair to say that at least part of Canada's lackluster innovation performance, depending on what metrics you want to pick to measure that, at least part of it has to do with our practices around intellectual property. And that includes, I think, not patenting as many ideas as we probably ought to, but also not protecting as many of those ideas that we have already patented as well as we should. And the people that I talk to about this, to the extent that I do, see that what they call IP literacy is part of the issue, right? So you're now seeing these initiatives at universities, at incubators and startups to help entrepreneurs develop a better understanding of the importance of IP, how to protect it, and how to use it to their advantage. So I would say, I mean, based on sort of indirect knowledge, I think it is part of the issue. I wouldn't want to quantify how much of our issue, because I think there are a lot of other ththings going on with respect to sort of the big reasons for Canada's innovation performance.
Thanks so much. Grace, how about you? What was it? Do you have any insight into the IP issues based on your journey?
Well, of course, we have a patent portfolio, but it's not inexpensive. Its average is about $25,000 to $50,000 to file a patent, to get it nationalized. And if you have to nationalize this patent in 150 countries, one patent runs you a lot of dollars. That's a lot of zeros. So it's not an insignificant undertaking to have an IP structure. I think Canada actually could help our entrepreneurs in that patent journey to make it easier to protect it in Canada and help Canadian SMEs launch worldwide and really become a domain for IP. That's my opinion. We've done it the old-fashioned way because there's no other option, but it takes some deep pockets to do that. And we can't underestimate that the cost it is to an entrepreneur or small company to do that.
Thanks. And John, do you want to elaborate a little bit on the program you mentioned and how that might help contribute to solving this issue?
Well, as I say, we're just starting, so we don't have much evidence of the effectiveness. But the idea is the same as the business strategy internships. I mean, for a small company, particularly a startup company, which is very cash starved, the notion of them bringing in, professional legal advice to produce an IP strategy is just beyond their means. And so this is, these are students who will be supervised by law school professors, and so there's a backdrop of solid expertise, and the students themselves are, of course, nascent experts, and the cost to the SMEs is minimal. And so I think it's just, as Grace said, I mean, I used to worry a lot about patenting when I was vice president of research at UBC, and it's an expensive business. And so, if you don't And you don't always need to patent. I mean, there's trade secrets, there's other approaches to IP, but you need to understand what they are. And, some, kid fresh out of engineering school who wants to start a company, they have a minimal idea about IP, but they need some more sophisticated help. And that's what we're offering. And we hope to do more of it. So it's complex because, of course, there are regulatory issues. You can't have law students, just randomly issuing advice. So I think that it is something that we're working on, and we hope it will contribute to again, producing this support across an innovation continuum for especially small and medium enterprises, which, as Grace pointed out, they're kind of the current backbone of our innovative economy.
So interesting as well, because when we look at this issue, again, through a broader lens applied to innovation, what we also see is most universities, again, focus on protecting the IP of the science and engineering grads and students. What we found at Ryerson is you can actually broaden that quite considerably, because often there are processes or approaches. One of our most successful commercialization efforts, for example, was around checklists that had been developed to improve practices in healthcare screening for diabetes or whatever. I've got a diversity assessment tool that one of the lawyers finally said, Wendy, you need to protect this. We need to register it, etc. And like never in a million years would I have considered a checklist to be IP. When you look at, we just did a survey with the Canadian Council on Aboriginal Business and found that when you look at Indigenous businesses, very high percentage of them have intellectual property associated with traditional knowledge and cultural practices, but no protections in place in order to really capitalize on that. So it's another one of those issues where if you start to pick away at through different lenses, you see that it's far more complex than kind of those traditional commercialization pathways that all of us have been inclined to think. There's another question that's popped up that I'll ask you to comment on, and that is the question is the cost of education an excluding factor to attract talent through the social fabric? What should Canada do to increase the talent pool, looking at some European models? I think it's an interesting question because we often compare ourselves to the US and think we have great public education. But when you compare it to some models in other parts of the world, we don't look so good. So Dan, do you want to kick the answer off to that?
Yeah, I think, so I guess two thoughts, right? One is that I think Canada is, if not unique, at least interesting, in that the quality of education across institutions fits within a relatively narrow band, right? The difference between what you might say is the top and the bottom is a lot narrower than it is, say, in the United States or in other places where there's a greater role for private education. And so I think, so one thing to say is that because of that sort of narrow range of quality, there are, I think, a lot of opportunities for people who might not otherwise get a good education to get one, because they can get one at just about any institution in Canada, right? Wherever you go, you're going to get a good education. On the sort of more specific question of whether or not, so from a financial perspective, Canadian institutions are accessible, and particularly whether they exclude certain communities and certain people. I'm not an expert in this, though. I think my understanding is that Canadian education is still relatively affordable. That there are a good suite of scholarships and grants and aid that ensures that just about everybody who wants to go can go. And yet, and I think this is the key, awareness of those opportunities to make education more affordable is not as widespread as it could be, right? So a lot of people will see the sticker price of an education rather than the true cost of an education once you factor in grants and scholarships and that sort of thing. And that might cause some people within some communities to not attend who otherwise might want to attend. But it does probably, I mean, both you, Wendy, and John, you might be, sort of better experts than me in understanding and knowing about the accessibility of higher education.
Good points. John, from your perspective?
Yeah, this is always, there's sort of simplistic solutions to the cost of education, like make tuition free, which, is the system in France, basically. And I would argue that France has a less accessible educational system than we do. But there is a very real opportunity cost. I mean, students, particularly students from families where there isn't a strong educational background, know that by going to school, they're going to give up employment opportunities. They're going to, as Dan said, they're going to have to leave their hometowns and move somewhere else and pay cost of housing and things like that. So I think the one thing that we could do better in Canada is the college system provides a lower barrier entry point into post-secondary, and we've got a good college system in Canada. So creating a better integration between the college system and higher levels of post-secondary education, whether at the undergraduate or at the graduate level, I think would help in terms of accessibility. But I think that the figures are that Canada has a huge fraction of the sort of 18 to 25 cohort that are participating in post-secondary. A lot of them are in the colleges, and so the question is that sufficient? Are the colleges enough for these students, or should we make better pathways for them to go beyond the initial college entry into post-secondary? I think that's the real challenge.
Really good points, and I think I think Dan's point about the quality of public education in Canada and also the rate of post-secondary grads is very important, because we know, regardless of where we stand with the innovation agenda, we know Canada has one of the highest social mobility rates in the world, defined as, your prospects are not the same as your parents, effectively. And our education system is definitely one of the drivers of that. So I'm going to come back. There was another question on IP that's come up here. How can we balance open science, open science and research that is crucial to advancing emerging technologies with the requirement of IP that is sometimes necessary for startup companies to succeed and get more private funding? Anybody want to weigh in on that? We can always take some of these questions and respond to them after the fact if they're not kind of in your wheelhouse. But Grace, do you have a view on that?
Well, that is something that we need to address as a company, because our technology is very innovative. There is no one else in the world who is replicating a nanomaterial such as ours. So we work very closely with Mitacs, with both UBC and SFU, and professors want to publish, reasonably so, and they want to possibly create courses on hydrogen storage. But we have a mandate to create shareholder value for our key stakeholders and to get to commercialization. So there's a bit of a race on us trying to get our innovation to market and then open it up for knowledge sharing. So it's a tricky question, and I think I have no idea how to address it, because from my perspective, I would like to tell you nothing. So just on a purely self-interested running my company kind of perspective, but as a citizen of the world, of course, we'd like to share, and science is meant to be shared. So it's a dilemma for sure.
It's interesting because for me, where this comes up a lot is in publication. And so I would really distinguish between, for example, Grace, your proprietary invented technology versus, my article on XYZ that's being published in a peer review journal article that's too expensive. And I do think that the grant councils have gone a long way to advancing open science by requiring all of us to publish in open access fora, as well as the traditional. So I do think there are some. Again, it's a continuum where we have to recognize we create and protect value versus where things are publicly funded. It makes a lot of sense, in my view, to make sure that they are also in some way publicly shared. John, any comments on open access and how to balance these issues?
Yeah, I think that this is something. I mean, obviously, open access is now that's what we're all supposed to be doing as researchers is making the results publicly available. But I think to balance Grace's intellectual property does need to be protected, and that's typically done through a delayed publication. And this is particularly true in pharmaceutical discoveries where you discover a potential drug molecule. Well, you have to hold back from telling your friends and your colleagues and conferences about it until you've secured an invention disclosure and you've protected the intellectual property, which is a very fast process. So open science with a delay to protect intellectual property. But just getting to what you said, Wendy, I think it is critical that if universities, which are publicly funded institutions using taxpayers' dollars for research, that eventually the results of that research protected so that it can be commercially exploited, but the results are made publicly available. And I don't see a contradiction between those two things. You can have open source science and still protect intellectual property.
And you can also distinguish between things that are primarily in the private domain and things that are in the public domain. I mean, I think encouraging collaboration among researchers and scientists has actually helped move some of the work on, for example, a COVID vaccine from what we've seen. So you do have the private interest, but you also have lots of collaboration that's kind of moving to advance the work forward together. So I think that's also a way to advance growth. I'm going to go back to some of the questions that we had previously set for ourselves, and ask you, John, to talk a little bit. You mentioned the inclusion issues and some of the initiatives that Mitacs has underway. Can you talk a little bit about some of the barriers to utilizing the human capital that we currently have available, and where people are being excluded that we need to include, what some of the strategies might be to advance that diversity and inclusion agenda? I know that Mitacs is really trying to lead the way in this space.
Yeah, I think it starts with redefining how you can support innovation. So first of all, having a broader understanding of what innovation actually is. But then one of the things, as an academic researcher, I'm used to the peer review system, which is always held up as the gold standard of deciding, high quality. And we've seen that with these vaccine disclosures going on, where we haven't seen the peer-reviewed results yet, and so therefore there's a note of caution. And sure, it looks great, but this is a press release; it's not peer-reviewed.
Yeah.
But peer review is also a barrier, and I think that we're learning at Mitacs how do we review things. For example, Indigenous projects with Indigenous communities. That's a very different style of research. And there's a different need for true community engagement and involvement in the research process. So you can't review that I mean, it's necessary. Mitacs, we want to be responsible stewards of taxpayers' dollars. And so we do want to make sure that what we support is of high quality and contributes to innovation in Canada. Okay. And so we have to figure out a way of reviewing projects that aren't the standard, academic research type projects in partnership with industry, for example. Those we know how to review. But if we now talk about a project with an Indigenous community, a Northern Indigenous community, that we can't subject to a standard academic peer review. So how do you review these things? How do you rethink what it is how do you judge impact? I mean, that's a question that I've been grappling with, during my decades-long career as a research administrator. Dead easy to use citation analysis and look at publications in Nature and Science and all the sort of academic metrics. But how do you judge impact on a community? How do you judge potential impact on a community? These are real challenges. And to fall back on the excuse of excellence, we can't hire that person because they don't fit our metrics of excellence, or we can't pursue that innovation project because we're not sure it's excellent. That's an excuse for not thinking more broadly about how do we judge impact and potential impact. I think that's a real challenge, and we have to grapple with that so that we don't keep on constructing barriers for different communities participating in the innovation economy.
Kind of music to my ears, and I will say, shout out to Mitacs, because the approach that you've taken really from the outset is there is peer review, but there's much more of a developmental approach than there is in some of the other granting agencies, where there are sometimes almost imaginary bars that people are trying to hit, and there's very little guidance given as to what is actually required. Whereas, at Mitacs, the tradition has been much more to engage with researchers early in the process, to engage with the businesses and to actually help craft projects that are more likely to be able to make it through the adjudication process, which to me is a far more sensible approach if you really build capacity and be more inclusive. I don't know, Dan, any views on the issues around view and quality versus excellence versus relevance in your world?
Well, I think so. The initial question that you asked, I think maybe I can respond to that, which is, what do we need to do to make innovation activities more inclusive? Because I think what you talked about was sort of one example of this broader question. And one way into this, I think, is to sort of highlight some work that my colleagues at the Brookfield Institute did recently that I think about quite a lot because I find it so striking. So they took a look at employment and wages and a sense of empowerment in what they call the tech sector, defined in a certain way. And they found, interestingly, that racialized people are more likely to have a higher education, more likely to be employed in technology occupations, but with like one exception, are paid less in those occupations than their white peers. And when they're surveyed, they report feeling less empowered to actually make decisions that affect the firm or affect whatever activities are going on. So that strikes me as so there's a really interesting puzzle there, right? Because on the one hand, you've got the people who are participating already have the education and some of the skills. So that doesn't seem to be the issue, right? Nevertheless, they're paid less and feel less empowered. That to me suggests that one of the things that we might be missing is a focus not simply on the innovators themselves, but the people who are doing the recruiting and managing of those people, right? So, we often focus on the skills and education required to participate in innovation, but I think it's just important to think about what we can do to change sort of the skills and attitudes of behaviors of people who manage the innovators, and to do that in ways that makes innovation, whatever sector it occurs in, sort of more inclusive.
Yeah, I think that's, our tagline on that is that a lot of employers are looking for skills in all the wrong places. And we know, for example, that research shows that if you have a foreign sounding last name as opposed to Dan Munro, you're 20% less likely to get an interview at a large company, 30% less likely to get an interview at an SME, even if you were born in Canada and educated in Canada. And I think the other piece of that is we do know that racialized people are overrepresented in tech, but if you segregate the racialized data, you will find almost no Black people, for example.
That's right. That's one of the big exceptions. Yep, and Indigenous people. Yep.
Yeah. So it is. It is. I think that data, making sure that we've got really good disaggregated data and we can really name the problem, is kind of the first step forward to driving an agenda that makes space for people who have the skills to move things forward. I don't know, Grace, do you have any views on the issues around diversity and inclusion? I mean, you're in an environment that's pretty male dominated. For example, any observations on what needs to happen to take advantage of human capital and make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind?
Well, I think there's two elements to that. What you mentioned before, what get measured becomes important. So if we measure employment equity, diversity, First Nations inclusion, then it becomes something that we can actually funnel target actions towards. But I think some of these programs, such as Mitacs and other skill development programs, should actually have diversity targets with a higher incentives for employers to do the right thing. At Hydrogen Emotion, we have 50% employment equity and diversity targets, which we meet and exceed. But no other company that I know of actually has written targets of diversity, of employment equity. And it shows up in things like there's structural issues. The 9-to-5 structure of the workplace is built around the male life. So childcare is between 10 and 2. And so, but you have a 9-to-5 shift. How is that possible? What about maternity leave? Every woman I've spoken to has had their career negatively impinged on by the fact they have to birth a child. And biologically, it's an imperative. So where are our policies that support gender diversity? So that, yes, we have paid maternal leave, but where do we protect our workers so that they don't get penalized for being human?
Such a good point. And, one of my happiest moments with the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub was when Rocco Rossi, who's the CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, stood up and said, as part of our She Covery report, that childcare is not a women's issue. Childcare is an economic issue. And we're seeing, I think COVID has really exposed many of those fractures in society and exacerbated inequality in so many ways. I mean, we heard 30% of women are considering not returning to the workforce because they're being crushed by the burden of unpaid work. So I do think when we think about these issues around diversity and inclusion, the idea of targets, critically important, but also getting some of the systemic issues that present barriers are huge. And, one of the populations we haven't talked much about are people with disabilities. What's so interesting to me is that if you look at the accommodation that most people with disabilities will cite, it's flexible work hours and the ability to work at home. And COVID has actually broken down a lot of barriers to that kind of flexible work, because we know university grads with severe disabilities have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts. And so it is a population we don't talk a lot about, but if you look at untapped human capital, I would argue that that's a big chunk of the talent pool that often we're not thinking about as well. So thanks for that. Dan or John, any other comments on the issues around diversity and inclusion and how to advance that? I think, Grace, you also, it seems to me on the call, you also mentioned you're part of the 50-30 challenge. Was that something that, am I right?
Yes, you're correct. You're correct.
Did you want to say anything about that? Just giving a plug for your sponsor?
Yes, that's NRCan is leading the charge on Equal by 30. And there's a 50-30. I can't remember who is the organization. Wendy, you'll have to fill that in. But I mean, you have to, there's a small participation percentage-wise of women in STEM. But if you look at their career, it tends to be halved within the first 5 years because of the child rearing aspect, and that entrepreneurs quite often are young men who are super insensitive to family obligations because they have none. And there's no requirement to be sensitive. There's no law, there's no regulation that forces entrepreneurs to treat people equitably based on biology or to accommodate.
And it goes deeper than that. We run about 7 incubators across the country targeting marginalized populations, Black women entrepreneurs, refugees, immigrants, and so on. And one of the biggest factors in terms of providing support that always comes out through the evaluations is we provide childcare on site. So as well as English language training and lots of wraparound services. But that, if you think about the innovation ecosystem and all the money that's going into supporting incubators and accelerators, and yet you look at their policies and practices, they are quite exclusionary. It's not just a question of the young male leaders of startups. It's also the infrastructure that we currently have in place to support entrepreneurs presents barriers that people don't even see.
Agreed.
Sorry, Dan, John, anything to add?
No, I was just going to comment that I lived in France for a while and was quite impressed, and this is now, well, it's 3 decades ago. Childcare was regarded as just a necessity. You know, when there was a day off school because the teachers had, the professional development day, you'd just take your kids to the mairie and drop them off, and they were taken care of. It was just assumed that childcare was a right. And it shows in the relative participation of French women in the workforce versus, for example, German women. I think the experience in
Canada in terms of the participation of Quebecois women.
Exactly, I was going to say, and it's had a real economic impact. It's had a real economic impact. So this is something that's bizarrely regarded as a cost to society, providing decent childcare.
Thanks so much. I'm just looking at the questions again. Here's a good one for you, Grace. If you could get any kind of expertise in your next hire or next intern, what would you look for? What a good question.
Well, I actually, so we did a lot of R&D for the last 6 years. So I brought chemists and material scientists and theoretical physics, all sorts of scientists to the table. We're scaling up now, and so now it's the engineering group. So I need process engineers, I need mechanical engineers, I need, but then we'll be looking at business development. So all the business people, marketing, sales, and of course, all the support. So the support tends to be people in the sciences, in the arts, because they have the best peer-to-peer or human skills to interact with people and to hear what the customer wants, be empathetic, and not scare away the people that we want to keep. So it's a diverse skill set, but I think my next hire is really focused on the engineering stage. But within the next 2 years, I'm looking to hire probably about 20 people. So it's time to scale up. But I would like to bring a point to Dawn about your work integrated learning. Mitacs is a fantastic program, and we are huge, massive supporters of what you do. But I think we could, as Canada, as a country, could actually get to the next level by converting this work integrated learning into sort of like a apprenticeship. So to do more, not just a couple years or a couple interns, but to bring a person right from beginning, doing their master's or a PhD or undergraduate or a trade, to be integrated in a company, learn from a company, because there's nothing like the real work job experience to say what's happening. And the company gives them opportunity to hire some people that they've already spent time training. And so it's a win-win. And I think that's really an opportunity. We at Hydrogen Motion, my commitment to STEM is I bring in, I have a Girls in STEM program that I stood up myself. And it's about bringing teenagers who are interested in STEM and actually teach them to be, what's it like to have a job in theoretical physics? What's it like to do computational science and to do material science and heavy chemistry, and to be an entrepreneur. So this person gets a real insight over a summer term of what is the art of the possible. And the kids leave very, very, very enthusiastic about a future that they can take control of.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. John, did you want to respond?
Well, it's actually part of our, begging government for extra flexibility and obviously money to support extra flexibility. And so the things you're talking about are things that we are interested in doing. I mean, this expansion into undergraduates, so not going down to the level of high schools, but getting undergraduates involved in research projects with industry is something we're quite interested in, but also post-graduation. Right now we're forbidden from working with students who are ex-students. You have to be registered in a full-time in a university program. We're asking government, we're begging government, let us work with students who are recently graduated. Part of it is the economic crisis. We don't want these people, driving Uber with their advanced degrees, but also it's just, as you say, integrating them, taking a final step of integrating them into the non-academic workforce, and also obviously helping out the the non-academic economy. So yeah, we're trying to do more of this, and it really depends on getting permission from our government masters first of all, and also getting the funding that we need to do these things. But I would say that the demand for what we're providing, and we keep getting asked, well, what's the limit to the number of internships that you think you could provide? And I don't think there necessarily is a limit. Well, ultimately there's a limit because there's a limit to the number of people, but there's a lot of demand out there, and we would like to do more because I think it's necessary to drive innovation in the country.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that, I call that the graduate period from when you cross the line and get your gown to when you actually get a job in your field. I call that the valley of death for students, because there are a lot of programs to support work integrated learning when you're a student, whether you're an undergrad through SWIP or Mitacs, or there's a host of programs. But where we really fall short is in supporting students who have graduated and are looking for that first job. And that's how I entered the workforce. My first master's degree was in medieval history, and I got hired at $100 a week working in an internship. because I had no clue. I knew nothing. And there's a class element to this as well, because often students also have no line of sight, especially if their parents didn't go to university, their parents are professionals. They have zero line of sight on where the career opportunities are. So I'm with you, and we should conspire. Daniel, do you want to jump in here on issues like work integrated learning and other kinds of innovations that can help ensure we take advantage of the talent that's out there?
Yeah, so I think, so one thing to say, so I've looked at, I've been a keen observer of what Mitacs has been doing over the years. Also what the Business Higher Education Roundtable has been doing with work integrated learning. And about 7 or 8 years ago, when I worked with the conference board, we looked at the applied research partnerships between businesses and colleges and polytechnics, where they would place students with a firm to work on some kind of innovation problem. And in all of this, and particularly sort of the college and polytechnics experience, one of the interesting things that we found was that, and this echoes one of the things that Grace said, was that the internships or the placement serves as a kind of extended job interview that benefits both the firm and the student that is participating. And one of the things that, we didn't quite articulate it in some of the work in this way, but, on reflection, it seems to me that, in doing a bunch of interviews and talking to people, students would find through their placements that there were certain skills that they wish they had that they didn't yet have or wanted to develop, that they would never have been aware of had they not gone through the internship. And on the other side of the table, there were firms who realized that there were some skills that their student interns had that they didn't know they needed and now can't live without, right? Yeah. So there's a kind of really interesting supply and demand in labor market information thing going on there, like a really sort of hyper local level that on the one hand is costly, right? Like, yes, that's a pretty costly sort of, long-term interview or way to figure out, skills. But, when you scale that, when you think about how much is actually saved on other ways of trying to do skills, supply and demand analyses, I think it's actually worth it to do it that way, right? That firms really see what they can get and what they need, and students see what they need to develop in a real grounded way.
I'm going to jump in here and pose the last question and then run and find my cable because I'm running out of juice. So the question is, how do we build a system where innovation skills are learned at all times through the lifelong career of a worker and a learner? And who's responsible? Is it the post-secondary institutions? Is it government? Is it industry? And I will be back momentarily.
So let me say this. I think that the higher education systems do a really good job of preparing people to learn, right? That is, we prepare people to be good lifelong learners, even if we don't necessarily give them all the skills that they're going to need for their entire careers. And obviously you can't do that because the nature of jobs change, the nature of the economy changes. So one thing that I'd like to see in this space is for Canadian firms to do more than they currently do in terms of training and development, right? So if you look at the data, Canadian firms tend to be not especially great when it comes to spending on training and development. And when they do spend, they often spend money on the people who least need new training and spend the least amount on people who most need new training, people in lower paying, precarious positions. So the one thing that I would say is that I'd like to see more attention to and spending on training and development by Canadian firms, because they are the ones who actually know what they need on the fly, and could make some good investments there.
I'm going to let Grace respond to that one.
Well, I'm a big fan of lifelong learning. It's always about, unfortunately, this is the nature of the private sector. It's all about the almighty dollar. And so, I think if going back to my point about employment equity and diversity, the people that are left behind usually are done so not because of malice of any kind. It's the communication style, and it's the soft skills that they're missing. And so, if there was a program that systemically assisted people in helping on that soft skill, then it would make life a lot easier for the SME to fund that.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns that I've heard, obviously, I think the university's post-secondary in general has a clear role to play, both with obviously the initial training, both through technical training and work integrated learning type training, but they also have at least some responsibility for continuing education. But the concern that I've heard, particularly from small and medium enterprises, is the reluctance to engage too much in training is that we'll spend money training somebody who will then get snapped up by Google because now they're added value. And figuring out a way to sort of, again, reduce the barriers so that it's not such an enormous sunk cost for the small and medium enterprises to provide these sort of training opportunities, and possibly in partnership with post-secondary. As I say, Mitacs mandate is limited to students, but maybe with an expanded mandate in partnership with Mitacs or other similar organizations. But I think there's a role for government to sort of reduce the cost for small and medium enterprises, so that they're not worried about spending money on training and then having somebody walk away to Google with all this training that the SME has paid for. So I think that's a potential issue. But I think getting the enterprises to participate more in training would be a good thing. They're the ones who know what the problems are and what training is necessary for the skilled workforce that they need.
John, to your point about decoupling or focusing on the workforce through the lived reality of the enterprise, I wonder if there's any appetite to decouple the Mitacs program from having a university partner, because that sometimes the university doesn't want to necessarily focus any education on certain elements like engineering or it's all dependent on the researcher. Is that something they want to research? So some of these skill development is more about developing the people and not about groundbreaking research. Is there any appetite to decouple that?
Well, part of the decoupling would be redefining what constitutes, like whether the program has to be driven by research, as I alluded to, the sort of peer-reviewed academic quality research. That's part of the issue. The other issue is, what's the responsibility for, in addition to helping out industry, helping out universities so they're more interested in this style of training. I see it, the ideal Mitacs program has everybody benefiting. The university learns something and maybe changes the way that they view student training. The student obviously gains an enormous benefit and hopefully a job at the end of the time, and industry gains a solution to problems. But in terms of completely decoupling, Mitacs is ultimately a student internship focused organization, and so we have to think about ways of expanding the mandate. Yes, but as of now, we don't have that expanded mandate. Being able to go post-graduation would help move us in that direction. So it's an interesting idea, but we need to, again, have discussions with our funders about an expansion of mandate to allow for things like that.
Yeah, if I can jump back in, having learned that my total battery life is 2 hours now on this computer.
You need a technological solution, I think.
I just wanted to say that some of us have done workarounds where we've created special sort of postgraduate courses that are free, but technically students get registered in something that can be counted. It does seem a bit bizarre that we have to turn cartwheels in order to create these opportunities, but I agree with you, Grace, completely. And in fact, there was a note in the chat saying, from someone who's just graduated with a master's degree, and probably during the course of doing the master's degree, they were focused on meeting the requirements of the master's degree rather than thinking so much about educational opportunities. So now might be the absolute perfect time to have that internship where they take all the stuff that they learned and apply it to solve a real problem in a company. And if the company likes them, they can then keep them. But we really don't have, in my view, the full suite of instruments we need to help. And Grace, I'm sure you would agree that when it comes to SMEs, the problem with traditional co-ops and a lot of internships is they're viewed as fairly expensive because you don't know if you're investing in someone you're going to be able to keep, because you could do this project with them and then they could go off and work for someone else, or in the case of co-op, they have to go back to school. One of the really important things about some of the innovative programming we've been experimenting with is that it's kind of a try them, you'll like them approach, where you get a student in to an employer, you give them a project where they can demonstrate their value, and then they can actually transition into employment. So, John, delighted to hear that you're working on innovative approaches to doing that. We are actually pretty close to time. So what I wanted to do at this stage was just give everybody sort of a minute to wrap up and answer any questions that you wanted to be asked that you weren't. Dan, did you want to make some final remarks?
So maybe I'll make two final footnotes. Two things. Let me put my nerdy research hat on for a minute. I think it's worth saying, and I think some of the things that you said, Wendy, about people with disabilities highlights this, is that our understanding of some of these issues depends on the availability of data. And while things have gotten better over the last couple of months with the inclusion of racialized people in the labor force survey, the data on people with disabilities in Canada is abysmal, right? We're working with understandings of their labor market outcomes that are sometimes 2 to 3 years old. So if without going into any of sort of the big issues, I would just say, we need to improve our understanding of what the skills and innovation ecosystem really looks like for different communities.
I think that's a super good point. John, what would you add?
Well, I just add that basically reiterate what I've been saying all along is how can we, as an organization, Mitacs now, move to better support innovation. I mean, the credo is that better innovation leads to better productivity, which makes for a better society. And when I say that, I mean innovation across the spectrum, not just industrial innovation, technological innovation. So how can we better do that? How can we better understand the challenge and support the challenge that Grace mentioned about, creating successful companies, not just creating a bunch of companies that then get bought up by bigger multinationals and disappear from the country, but what can we do to create an innovation ecosystem that not only starts companies but grows them up into success, and how can we as an organization, an internship based organization, support that activity across the spectrum? So I've found the conversation actually really, really good, so I've enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. And Grace, last word to you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for allowing me to join this fascinating conversation. John, Wendy, Daniel, you've been really so eye-opening in from your perspectives, but what my last word is to the listener, the people, maybe the possibly young or not so young people who are listening, who think, how hard is it to be an entrepreneur? How hard is it to be an innovator? The great thing about innovation is there's so much we don't know. It's a vast, vast world out there. And so my advice is just do it. Just try it. It's so easy to start a company in Canada. You can go online and be registered as a limited company within 20 minutes. You have nothing to lose. Sure, it's time and it's effort, but all of life is time and effort. So just do it, bring your cat, do everything you need to do, and you see what you can achieve in this world.
Thanks so much. That's such a great note to end on. And you know, I'll simply add that if you're doing something you love and you're inspired by, it does not feel like work.
Fantastic.
So thanks to everybody, and thanks very much to Mitacs for kind of pulling this together and inviting all of us, and thanks to the Canada Science Policy Council for organizing the conference, the sponsors, the tech support who helped get us all online, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.